Sri Aurobindo has led us through a detailed study of the Kena Upanishad, showing us the deeper meaning behind many of its cryptic passages and symbolic narratives, showing also how there is an integrity of the text where each verse supports all others, and the full sense of it begins to sink only when we see each verse in relation to all others to form a more comprehensive experience. In his last chapter on his commentary, titled A Last Word, Sri Aurobindo stands back from what the Kena teaches to make certain critical observations. Recognizing the great value of the text, its central message, he has turned now to describing its limitations also, where the Kena Upanishad follows from the Vedic inspiration. There is already a slight tilt towards a final passage of withdrawal, which, as the centuries pass, becomes more and more prominent, not only in the Upanishadic texts, but in the popular turn of spirituality all over the world. And to this slight tilt, Sri Aurobindo points and says that wherever a text falls short, we have to look outside it for that which is missing. Even a great scripture, luminous, profound, and sublime in its unsurpassed truths, beauty, and power, such as the Kena, if there is something missing, we must look beyond. And for this, he gives a few examples, drawing particularly on parallel religious texts of a later period from different traditions, to show how, although in each of them there were elements of withdrawal from life, there was in each of them also a seed which pointed to a greater possibility. In the earlier portion that we read, there was a reference to the language of the Quran, where he says, God did not create heaven and earth in a jest. And in the context of the vocabulary of Vedanta, he says, Brahman did not begin dreaming this world in a moment of aberration and delirium, suggesting a larger collective awakening, not merely an individual liberation, that is the greater goal. In the portion we finished last time, he points out also that the Kena Upanishad, as most Upanishads, have a strong orientation, emphasis to the divine knowledge. But we have also now to complement them with the later teachings and the emphasis of the divine love, which we see in the Bhagavad Gita, and the emphasis of the Veda on the divine works, so that the three complement each other in our own larger understanding and practice. We continue now with the text, where Sri Aurobindo makes reference to three traditions, the Vedic, the Christian, and the Puranic, to show certain symbols, differently stated, but which point to this larger fulfillment and a collective awakening towards which we have to go. He then explains why in the intervening passage there had to be this exaggerated emphasis of a withdrawal from life, why there had to be this almost childish seeming morality of reward and punishment in almost every religious tradition in this declining phase of the last 1,000 years. And he justifies them in the larger context of evolution. So we will see all that now. The next paragraph he begins, the Vedic gospel of a supreme victory in heaven and on earth for the divine in man, the Christian gospel of a kingdom of God and divine city upon earth, the Puranic idea of progressing avatars ending in the kingdom of the perfect and the restoration of the golden age not only contain behind their forms a profound truth, but are necessary to the religious sense in mankind. So all three traditions are pointing to something which superficially you might see in a limited sense. If you look more deeply at its esoteric meaning, you discover that each of these contain behind their forms a profound truth. And we will look at each to have a sense of that truth. And that they were necessary for some part of humanity. Not the rational part, not so much the intuitive part, but the religious nature in human beings needed these messages or symbols. And how these messages have over time been perhaps led to an exaggeration, we will see also. And the correction also contained in each of these we will touch upon as we look at it now. So in the Vedic teaching, throughout the text of the Veda, there is this underlying sense of the battle of the gods against the demons. This battle takes place in the cosmos. It takes place equally within the human being, in the human mind, in the human heart, in the human evolving consciousness. Are represented the evolutionary powers which are also cosmic in their working, but now in us taking an individualized function, as well as on the other side the anti-divine titanic forces which oppose the evolution, and these two are represented in us in their working in an individualized sense. And so we, seeming to be a miniature battlefield of the cosmic battlefield, are also, therefore, the center on which the conquest must first take place. The conquest cannot first take place in the cosmic battleground because the cosmos itself is a neutral party. But in the human being individualized, the same battle represented, we have a conscious mind. We have a conscious choice, and we are no more a neutral battleground. We can choose to align ourselves with the forces of evolution or the other way. But in that choice, the entire battleground tilts, so to say, ensuring even the certainty of the victory of the evolutionary divine forces against the regressive forces. And in the human being, therefore, when this battle is won, it is the ground in which, in the cosmos, the battle is won. And the effect then can be established, spread out and established in the totality of the cosmos over time. So the human being is seen as the front runner of this battle and the most prized possession by both the divine beings and the regressive powers. And so this theme is in the Veda throughout, and the Veda itself offers in its unfolding movement of the descriptions of the struggle, the supreme victory in heaven and on earth for the divine in man. The victory takes place both in the cosmic as well as in the material and in the individual. And the emphasis here particularly is the realization in matter on earth and in the human being, in the heart of mankind. The battle is won, and therefore the establishment of the divine victory and the divine rule. Now you'll see how this smoothly transitions to the second example he takes from the Christian gospel of a kingdom of God and divine city upon earth. These references appear in the text which is called Revelation of John, the last chapter of the New Testament in the Bible. The original Aramaic word for kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God is actually a reference to kingdom of heaven, not so much God. And the word for kingdom is Malkut, representing not a material territory, but the sovereignty, the rule of the divine. And so the kingdom of heaven, if we look at its sense more deeply, it suggests the divine rule established. And if it's heaven, it is cosmic, similar to what Sri Aurobindo describes earlier as the supreme victory of the gods in heaven. And on the other side, there is the divine city upon earth. And this also comes in the same text in the Revelation 21:2. The text goes like this. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Now you see the city emerging out of God and coming down, and the symbolism of the bride and husband is the symbolism often in such esoteric traditions of the union of nature and soul. And in the book of Revelation, when we look at the context in which this takes place, we find something quite extraordinary. And I want to touch upon this because for those of us who are familiar with the yoga tradition, the sense of it will immediately become obvious. The text of the book of Revelation itself describes a series of sevens, 5 different types of sevens before this appearance of the city of God and the kingdom of heaven takes place. And it begins with the 7 messages for 7 churches of Asia. Asia was not reference to the eastern part of India and China, but Asia Minor, which is close to the Middle East. So 7 messages go to the 7 churches, and the church you must see more as focal points of centers of the influence of the divine. And the next, there is the appearance of the throne of God surrounded by 24 thrones of the elders, and a scroll with 7 seals is presented. And the next thing that happens is the 7 seals are opened. And the moment you look at the phrase 7 seals opened to the yogic tradition, immediately you have the suggestion of the 7 chakras, which are seals in the sense they are closed, and when they are opened, you have the full divine revelation. Subsequently, and each of these seals is described as it is opened, and as a result, after the 7 seals, you have the 7 trumpets which are sounded, which represent the movement to express, to manifest. Again, to the yogic mind, the image becomes so obvious because the chakra is often seen as emerging from a center, opening out in the front like a trumpet. The shape is literally like a trumpet opening outwards. And so the 7 trumpets which are sounded has a very clear sense of the chakras opening and then manifesting their powers, their influence, and so on. There is as a result, again, the 7 spiritual figures which come forward, and they are each described. And finally, 7 bowls which are poured onto the earth. And the result of each of these bowls being poured. And as in the aftermath of all this, there is the judgment of the 2 beasts which represent the regressive powers. And finally, the new glorious heaven replaces the old earth. God comes to dwell with humanity in the new Jerusalem, which is the new city, and there's a description of the new city, and the river of life and the tree of life now appear, healing the nations, and the curse of sin is ended. We have to again see in the biblical tradition, the original word for sin, when you go back all the way to Aramaic, is the word for ignorance. and which matches perfectly with the yogic tradition, where ignorance is the only sin. It is not a moral position that is seen, and it is a liberation from ignorance which is the goal of the yoga. And if you look at it, the whole text in this sense, from the esoteric perspective, it is so obvious that it describes some kind of a manifestation or a revelation of the divine rule, not only on a cosmic scale, but in the individual in particular, because this idea of the divine city is where God comes to live, with his throne in the center, representing our own being, which is the city. There have been, in fact, many Christian leaders who have made these analogies with the Vedic tradition in their esoteric understanding of it. We come now to the third idea, which is the Puranic. And Sri Aurobindo distinguishes the Puranic clearly, both from the Upanishadic and the Vedic. In the Veda, the primary expression is of an intuitive consciousness that lives in the experience and reveals in intuitive symbols. In the Upanishad, the same truth comes down to a level of the mind and takes on a rational, logical, even philosophical forms, keeping still the overall symbolism of the Veda and the sense and the vocabulary of the Veda. Successively in time, then, the Upanishads become more and more rationalized and therefore narrow and specific. And eventually, there is the Puranic phase in which the same symbols, the same stories have a character which is much more human. The gods become humanized. They are now as ignorant as human beings, just having extra powers. They don't know their oneness, they don't know their divinity, or only partly know it. They're quarreling, struggling among themselves. And every time the problem, they have to go all the way to the trinity of the higher divinity for the help, and so on. Very similar to the pattern we see in the Greek civilization, where the Greek gods too in their origin have a more divine sense, but in the later part, as it survives, they become largely humanized and quarreling among themselves, often worse than humans in some ways. So Sri Aurobindo makes clear distinctions between these phases and the way in which they express. But the effect of the Puranic phase was that these deep truths came down into the common life of humanity and became stories taught to children. And a child listening to these stories, which have in their roots still the original Vedic inspiration and symbol, would find his mind and his heart engaged on a deeper level. As he grows up, he approaches the same words and symbols from a more mature understanding. And eventually, if he chooses to enter into the Upanishadic or the Vedic texts, suddenly the symbols open out to their full power. But all the time they were implanted like seeds within the child, nourishing from within subtly through their narration and symbolism. And so Puranic had its purpose also. And what is the Puranic idea, which is the dominant theme? The Puranic idea of progressing avatars, ending in the kingdom of the perfect and the restoration of the golden age. Most obviously, this is seen in the sequence of the 10 avatars: the fish, the tortoise, the wild boar, the half man, half animal, the dwarf man, the vital man, the sattvic man, which is in Rama, and then Krishna, representing, Sri Aurobindo says, the over-mental consciousness, the Buddha, coming in the sequence, not as an evolutionary sequence, but representing the power of withdrawing from evolution to ascend to the transcendence, bypassing the evolutionary movement. And this, we will see shortly in the next paragraph, why this was important. And Sri Aurobindo justifies the need for this exaggerated or exclusive withdrawal. And then comes the Kalki, who fulfills this, bringing the kingdom of the perfect and the restoration of the golden age. And he is described as riding a white horse, carrying a sword. And the mother makes a reference to the symbolism here. The horse is the power that he brings to conquer. The white represents the purity of the power, the spiritual power. The sword is the sword of knowledge that cuts through ignorance. And then a very interesting conversation where one of the disciples says, "But mother, in the tradition they say the Kalki avatar has a limp." And then mother says, "Oh, that's perhaps why the subconscious suggestion in the collective led to Sri Aurobindo's accident." Very clearly making the correspondence of Sri Aurobindo's role here, which is obviously seen when we look at the definition and the role of the avatar, who brings a new level of consciousness and turns human destiny by lifting it to that new possibility. And there are, of course, a series of vibhutis which prepare different aspects of this ascent. But the culmination of this, of the rule of the Kalki, is the avatar's ending in the kingdom of the perfect. There is this purification that takes place, and the golden age which had declined is now restored. The Kalki initiates the new golden age. So Sri Aurobindo says not only these contain behind their forms a profound truth, but they are necessary for the religious sense in mankind. And you can see how these narratives could tap or touch humanity on so many levels: rational, emotional, even giving to it a physical form that here we have to create the New Jerusalem. We have to restore in the human life the golden age. We have to participate in the battle of the gods against the regressive forces. And so the whole practical form that it can also acquire in inspiring human life to lift life, to make it more beautiful, more perfect, in alignment with the ideal that is glimpsed. The sense of the certainty of the evolution and the culmination and the realization, which are necessary for the religious heart to then be able to give itself without fear or holding back. And so Sri Aurobindo describes what is the result of this. Without it, the teaching of the vanity of human life and of a passionate fleeing and renunciation can only be powerful in passing epochs, or else on the few strong souls in each age that are really capable of these things. The rest of humanity will either reject the creed, which makes that its foundation, or ignore it in practice while professing it in precept, or else must sink under the weight of its own importance and the sense of the illusion of life, or of the curse of God upon the world, as medieval Christendom sank into ignorance and obscurantism, or later India into stagnant torpor and the pettiness of a life of aimless egoism. Long sentence, but what he's saying here is showing you what happens if you remove these profound truths which were given through these symbols, which were necessary for the religious sense in mankind. If you remove these, what will happen? You'll find what remains is a few ascetics who will teach that human life is vain. What's the point? After all the struggle, you end up with the same loss. Everything breaks down. Eventually, everything collapses. You build a great empire. The empire breaks down. You build a wonderful house. Eventually, the bricks and the roof fall. Anything you do eventually decays. So, the vanity of life is what they preach. And as a result, get out of this. A passionate fleeing. An intense passion which could have been turned Godward is now turned in a fleeing from the world Godward. And a renunciation. And these teachings of the ascetic, he says, Sri Aurobindo says, can be only powerful in passing epochs or on a few strong souls in each age that are really capable of these things. Meaning not all of humanity is capable of such a ascetic withdrawal. To discard life with this kind of a passion is not possible for everyone, or at best during a certain age, a large mass of humanity chooses that, as we see happening in the last 2000 years approximately, pretty much all over the world. A large mass turned. In fact, the best of humanity turned to an otherworldly withdrawal, leaving life impoverished. Sri Aurobindo points out that the last creative outburst in India is seen about 1,000 years ago, 800 to 1,000 years, during which time a few creative outbursts took place, but the bulk of the best minds, the strongest leaders of humanity, turned away in withdrawal and in disgust from life. Well, that was an epoch, it was the age. But once that age is past, or before that age, this is not an ideal which attracts humanity. Only a few who are meant for that kind of a strong, harsh discipline can follow that. And we discussed this last time, how everywhere, all over the world, in all religious traditions, young people refuse to enter a monastic life. But they still seek the monastic teaching to imbibe from it the elements relevant for the fulfillment of their life. So what happens? These teachings which Sri Aurobindo referred to, the Vedic gospel, the Christian gospel, the Puranic idea, all of these are nourishing humanity as distinct from the ascetic ideal which would ask humanity to go away. What they teach through these gospels, they give hope. They give hope because, he says, without that hope, humanity would sink under the weight of its own impotence. If you are not shown that there is going to be a divine life, that there is going to be some kind of a divine revelation, some kind of victory of the divine or the gods and the rule of the divine, if you are not shown that as a visible and certain result, you will say, what can I do? I am helpless against this whole struggle, chaos, ignorance, the hostile powers and the evil people who rule and control the powers and the money in the world. We are helpless. And so humanity would sink under the weight of its own impotence, and the sense of the illusion of life or the curse of God upon the world will lead to stagnation or ignorance or obscurantism. Now he gives you two different forms in which the negative sense comes. One relating to the Indian space and the other European space. These were the two dominant which have still left their imprint all over the world. And of the Indian, he says, the sense of illusion of life and our importance. What did it lead to? It led to the ignorance and obscurantism, or later India into stagnant torpor and pettiness of a life of aimless egoism. Once you have accepted the world is an illusion, what do? If you're not going to get out of it, what do? Well, you just fulfill your moment's desire. The pointlessness, the aimlessness of the egoism and the relapse into pettiness of life becomes inevitable. On the other side, where you have the world to be such a dark place, it must be because of the curse of God. And this is what the Christianity or the church taught in Europe, that the whole world is cursed. We are all cursed. In our very birth, we have been cursed, not because of our fault, but because of Adam and Eve. And the whole world is cursed, and you have no salvation except by the church and through whatever mechanism it offered. And the result of that medieval Christendom was the sinking into ignorance and obscurantism. If everything is cursed, what do? You chase blindly after whatever you're told is the correction to get free from that curse. And then you're fed whatever it is those in power will feed for that purpose. It went so extreme. Today we look back and we laugh at it. But the church even said that for your sins, you could pay enough money and your sins would be absolved by the authority of God given to the Pope, delegated to the local priest living in your neighborhood. And so people would actually give up money in order to be free of their sins. And somehow, in the degree of the obscurantism that it brought, people could not even recognize that they were being fooled. They believed in it and blindly followed it. The imprint of that still remains in Europe. It takes two forms. One is those who have somehow got that sense of the curse and the redemption. We know, for example, of people who all through their life had been atheists, rejecting the church, rejecting religious teachings. But when they reached their deathbed, they said, just in case, please call the priest and let me go through the last rites of confessing so that I might get my ticket to heaven. And somehow that fear was embedded deep. And on the other side, it takes a form where people reject anything to do with religion. Well, Christianity being the dominant form of the religion, then anything to do with religion, God, or divinity is thrown out, and a kind of crude, crass materialism is there, in which the saving grace takes this form that let me do good for myself and for my neighbors. Now you'll see this also came through the teaching or the influence of Christianity, as Sri Aurobindo will show us, the exaggerated form in which the good and bad were presented by religion in different spaces. That still remains, the benefit of it still remains, even as the imprint of the darkness remains. So, to counter all this, the religious sense in mankind needed these ideas of a supreme victory in heaven and earth for the divine in man, or the kingdom of God and divine city upon earth, or the progressing avatars ending in kingdom of perfect and restoration golden age. These are the gifts for the common man who cannot follow the ascetic ideal. So the rest of humanity will either reject the creed which makes that its foundation, the renunciation, or ignore it in practice while professing it in precept. And we see that still today. You reject this idea that the world is cursed, along with the religion. But you still somewhere have the taint of it that you have to somehow withdraw from the world if you are to be a good person. And good people in society will often say, yes, but I don't wish to have power. I don't want money. It corrupts. I would rather be nice and good and do my little thing here. That imprint is so strong. I still remember once meeting somebody in one of the very ascetic traditions in India, in the Jain tradition, and he was a wealthy man with a very successful business. And he made this comment saying, when will I be free from all these worldly attractions? When will I be called for the ultimate renunciation? And I thought to myself, why is this man even saying it? He's enjoying his life. He's actually happy in what he does. But this is what Sri Aurobindo says, the ignoring all that in practice while professing it in precept. So you speak the nice words of asceticism, but you ignore it when it comes to practice. You still live your life of comfort. Now, all of this, you see, is a very complex idea. You have the ascetic ideal, and you have the mass of humanity who cannot follow the ascetic ideal or rejects and makes these distortions. For that mass, for the religious sense, these greater ideals, which are not ascetic, were necessary. And then he summarizes this in a different image. The promise for the individual is well, but the promise for the race is also needed. So what the ascetics offered was an individual liberation. But what these symbols and gospels offer is the liberation for the collective, for the race. Our Father Heaven must remain bright with the hope of deliverance, but also our Mother Earth must not feel herself forever accursed. It's a very different symbol which you will find much more in the nature worshipping traditions. So in the Native American tradition, in many of the tribal traditions all over the world, including in India, we have this vocabulary of sun as father, earth as mother, or the sky as father and earth as mother. Now, again, there's a deep symbolism here. The relationship, why do we put father, mother? We could have said something else, brother, sister. But father, mother as a relationship is the act of union that leads to the new birth. And the relationship is the father plants the seed, the mother holds the womb, nourishes the seed, and gives birth to a new form. And so our Father heaven must remain bright with the hope of deliverance. If heaven is also clouded, we must have the hope that heaven one day will be liberated. But our Mother Earth must not feel herself forever accursed. And you'll see this again in the symbol in Christianity, where the fall begins from paradise and it is led by the woman. It is the woman's fault for tempting the man, leading to the collapse into ignorance or sin. And then earth is sinful thereafter, because that's what they have brought on earth. Or in the later Vedantic tradition, the world is a domain of suffering and ignorance. In the Buddhist tradition, it is a suffering from which you can never be free in the world. You can withdraw from it, but you can never be free in the world. Sometimes at best there is the correction of compassion with which you assist others who are suffering. But suffering itself in the nature is the nature of the world. Or in the later Vedantic tradition, because suffering could not be an underlying reality, Shankaracharya saw it as an illusoriness of the world, and therefore the suffering became part of the illusion. But still the idea of withdrawal becomes necessary, and the earth, Mother Earth, is somehow cursed because of this. These cannot remain. They have to be corrected for by this ideal of a collective awakening. But I was describing Mother Earth because the symbol there is very clear. From the heavens comes the descent of the divine consciousness and divine will, entering the earth consciousness, and this includes us as human beings, which are a part of the earth. Awakening as a seed within our heart, that divine possibility, and giving birth eventually to a new humanity, or a new city, the New Jerusalem, or the new kingdom of God on earth, whatever form the symbolism may be. But this is the birth that the earth mother gives. The earth that we have is the lower nature. She gives birth to the new consciousness and a new world in a new nature which is awakened, and a super nature or a divine nature. This is the larger background with which we understand the importance of these ideals for the religious sense in mankind. Now Sri Aurobindo explains why the exaggerations were relevant, both the ascetic as well as the moral exaggerations. He says, it was necessary at one time to insist, even exclusively, on the idea of individual salvation, so that the sense of a beyond might be driven into man's mentality. Beyond with a capital B, meaning the transcendence, beyond space-time, beyond existence, beyond form, beyond manifestation even, might be driven into man's mentality. Why this driving in, hammering in? Because, and this is the way nature works, Sri Aurobindo explains elsewhere, she must embed something, develop a possibility, and then she turns to another possibility. Now, if in the second movement, the first movement's benefits are washed out, it would be pointless to go through different phases of training or development. It has to be drilled in each phase to such a degree that even when now human evolution takes a form or focus which is completely the opposite, the benefit of this aspect or this extreme will not be lost. He gives the example of how the church training in Europe taught the European culture the blind extreme obedience to whatever was shown as an ideal. When the church influence was lifted, it was replaced by science. The same blind obedience continued now to science. The discipline that it established continued as a structure of organization of society, which came through the Roman influence. And this blind acceptance and obedience to what is revealed by science and a mechanical bringing it into application in life is the benefit that you see remaining today, when the ruler of the church has been replaced by the ruler of science. And when tomorrow, or in the present already, the rule of science is beginning to falter, and a new, deeper, intuitive or mystical or a spiritual influence begins to take its place in a post-modern world, the same blind obedience will take the revelation of that deeper spiritual influence and bring it in a disciplined and structured organization of life. And all of this is the lasting benefit of that period, even if that period was associated with an extreme of ignorance and obscurantism. So he says this phase of exclusive insistence of idea of individual salvation was necessary so that the sense of a beyond might be driven into men's mentality. It's so deeply that you will never lose it. There is always the idea of, yes, there is something greater, and that cannot be forgotten. We find the same thing happening in India, with the sense of the beyond so deeply embedded that even when in the modern India that we see, there is a strong turn among the youth for a blind imitation of Western materialism and its values. Yet if you scratch the surface, you will find behind a sensitivity to an idea of a transcendence or a spiritual or higher liberation not lost. And at some point that will come forward and find its balance or harmony with the material possession and the spiritual realization. He gives now the second example. As it was necessary at one time to insist on a heaven of joys for the virtuous and pious, so that man may be drawn by that shining bait towards the practice of religion and the suppression of his unbridled animality. So this idea of heaven and earth, heaven and hell, reward in the afterlife or punishment in the afterlife, Sri Aurobindo says, was necessary. Why? Because the mass of humanity, which had still the strong animal drives and passions, had to practice something by which they would suppress the animality and turn to something higher as a virtuous or pious life, a moral drive, which we would accept only if there was a reward which was visible and close enough. So in India, it took the form, particularly in the post-Buddhist influence, it took the form of the karma theory becoming extremely rigid in its formation, quite different from the Vedic sense of the karma, which is much more fluid. And with it, the idea that you will be rewarded in the next life. If you live a pious life, you will have better and better lives as you go along. Your circumstances, not only in this life, but in the future lives, are guaranteed if you do good. Just as the suffering today is the result of your past sins, for which you are paying now. And this has such a vivid sense for the animality in human beings. The animal instinct says, oh yes, I want better, I want more, I want greater comfort, happiness, joy, which is being promised, and you see the rationale of it, you see the result of it painfully, and so you make the effort. And so he says, it was necessary to insist on a heaven of joys for the virtuous and pious, so that man might be drawn by that shining bait. Here's a lollipop, an attraction to practice of religion and suppression of unbridled animality. So in India, the reward in heaven was not so strong. It was more the eventual liberation, which would have the heavenly character, through the cycle of births and the freeing from the cycle of birth and death. In Europe, with Christianity, because of the concept of a single life, the reward was in the heaven immediately after your life ends. And so for that, even people accepted a most painful suffering with the idea that the more the suffering, the more pious you become, the greater the reward, and so on. And you can see how powerful this attraction was, at least for that level of development of the mind of humanity in that space, in that period. Today, if you offer the same lollipop, people will simply reject it as saying, "Are you trying to take me for a fool?" Why? Because the rational thinking mind has already formed sufficiently to look at these objectively, and of course there is a skepticism which comes with it. But you see the value of it to help break out of the animal instinct to organize a higher, pious and virtuous life. And then Sri Aurobindo says something so extraordinary. It is one of those mind-blowing statements. But as the lures of earth have to be conquered, so also have the lures of heaven. The lure, that which attracts, which pulls you to leave your comfort for something greater. You have the lures of earth. It can take the practical form of, oh, this is so pleasant, this is so comfortable, this is so attractive, this is so satisfying. And so I chase after those satisfactions. Food, satisfaction of desires of various kinds, satisfaction of possession, ownership, dominance, knowledge, whatever form it is, you're chasing after those lures. And these are the lures of earth. What the virtuous and pious man does is he says, I choose a higher virtue, a higher lure against the lower. In the Puranic tradition, this is very explicitly stated when Nachiketas is taught by Yama of the distinction between Shreya and the Preya. Preya is that which is pleasant to your senses right now. Shreya, that which is the greater good, which has a long-term value. And the choice to be made between these two, so that you may rise and grow in consciousness to a higher status of living in consciousness. On a more crude level, it is the lollipop of the church saying, you do all these good things, follow the religion, restrain your animality, and you will get your reward in heaven with all the wonders. In Islam, you have a very obvious form in which, if you have followed all the rules of God, well, you will be given a life in heaven which is full of flowing waters, which are perfumed. So for a desert people, that's attractive. And with 72 virgins. Now, people laugh at that because it's so obviously a trick. But what is interesting is, if you go into the original symbols, the 72 suggests something deeper. 72 relates also to the Indian tradition, where we have the idea of 72,000 nerve endings in the human body, in the Ayurvedic tradition. And so 72 represents primary nerves in the nervous system of the human body, virgins, pure, whom you enjoy. So the sense is the heaven in which your whole being lives in a blissful state. Now, it is possible that in the original language, this was the language used, but as you can see in all languages, the symbolic element is then lost to a literal translation, and the word meanings become more crude and limited, which could take such a form. But to the yoga tradition, this number gives you a hint of something more profound. But still, the idea that you get the reward for living a pious life and following religion. This, just as the lure of earth has to be conquered by the lure of heaven, he says eventually the lures of heaven also have to be conquered. Meaning we should be able to now get beyond that attraction of satisfaction in heaven or afterlife or next life. For what then? What is the greater truth by which we will live? And he explains this now. The lure of a pleasant paradise, of the rewards of virtue, has been rejected by men. And this is so obvious. You cannot anymore tell somebody, give me your money now and you will have your heaven after death. It doesn't work. The Upanishads belittled it ages ago in India. And it is now no longer dominant in the mind of the people. And it's all over the world. The similar lure in popular Christianity and popular Islam has no meaning for the conscience of modern humanity. So one of the means by which many terrorists are programmed by misuse of the Islamic teaching is to tell them that in blowing yourself up or in killing the non-believers, you will be rewarded in heaven with all these things. And you see how humanity looks at this. For the conscience of modern humanity, this has no meaning. And yet at one time, people went to war with the same idea of a jihad in which if you died, you were rewarded in heaven with all these things. There is still one more lure which remains, which is more sophisticated. The lure of a release from birth and death and withdrawal from the cosmic labor must also be rejected, as it was rejected by Mahayanist Buddhism, which held compassion and helpfulness to be greater than nirvana. You see, the lure in Buddhism and in the later Vedanta was that you will get free from birth and death and withdraw from this cosmic struggle and rest, depending on which tradition. The Buddhism would rest in the nihil, the emptiness, whereas the Vedantin would rest in the Satchidananda, withdrawn from the world. But he says, even in Buddhism, there was the Mahayana movement which rejected this, and it held that in a suffering world, instead of withdrawing as an individual, the greater fulfillment is the compassion and helpfulness to your fellow suffering people. And this is greater than nirvana. And the ideal given in the Mahayana tradition was of the Buddha himself. As he was about to merge into the nirvana, he paused, turned back, and gazed upon humanity with compassion. And his compassion was so great precisely because emerging from the oneness of the brink of form and dissolution beyond form, that he promised that he would not withdraw until all of humanity was liberated from suffering and would be there to assist humanity. So this is the aspect of Buddha which turns back upon life with that compassion, the Amitabha Buddha, who embraces humanity and helps us to be free of the suffering. This is the greater ideal presented. We all should become such living embodiments of the Buddha's compassion. This is greater than nirvana. And this is the ideal in the Mahayana as distinct from the Hinayana or the Theravada tradition. So he gives this as an example that even this lure of the release from birth and death and withdrawal from the cosmos must be rejected. And what does that mean? As the virtues we practice must be done without a demand of earthly or heavenly reward, so the salvation we seek must be purely internal and impersonal. It must be the release from egoism, the union with the divine, the realization of our universality, as well as our transcendence. And no salvation should be valued which takes us away from the love of God in His manifestation and the help we can give to the world. So this is the demand for today. And in order to assist this demand, you see happening also all over the world, the strong turn to attraction for a fulfillment in life. Even if at first it is for a comfort, creature comfort and fulfillment of desire, very quickly it moves beyond that to fulfillment in helping others, serving humanity. So what happened for us? Our virtues, which were earlier done for a demand of earthly or heavenly reward. Look at the first stage was earthly reward. If I am good, if I am virtuous, tomorrow my parents will give me this lollipop. Or society will put a plaque with my name. Or my karma will get me a better life. My business will become more successful if I do good from the beginning in my business, because I will develop positive merit and positive karma. So the idea was, in doing good, I would benefit good. It moved to, in doing good without my benefiting here, eventually in heaven or in some other state of consciousness or in another life, I would get my good merit. And you can see these are powerful supports for the consciousness to rise to something higher. But now we have to go beyond that. The salvation we seek must be without demand also, and without heavenly reward, in what must be purely internal and impersonal. This freedom we seek must be realized as an inner freedom, without a personal focus, but for all in life, and what form it takes practically. And he describes these 4 facets of it. First, the release from egoism. Very important to distinguish between egoism and ego. Ego is the sense of separateness which allows you to have an individual life. Egoism is the constant reference to yourself as the primary center of the universe. The ego tells me I am different from the tiger and I must protect myself from the tiger. Otherwise, without the ego, the tiger is hungry, all right, eat me. I'm as good as anything else, isn't it? So the ego helps you separate to protect your individuality, allowing it to develop. Egoism, it says, I can kill the tiger to make money, or to protect my family, or to whatever personal benefit I may have. I can destroy the earth because it serves my immediate short-term profitability. That's the extreme of egoism. So the release from egoism may not always involve the full dissolution of the ego. It may even be a practical position where I am no more living for myself. I have dedicated my life to service, to all, and that's it. So the release from egoism. Second, the union with the divine. And this involves dissolution of the ego. Who is the person who unites with the divine? My sense of I, which is separate, now becomes conscious that I am only a special focus of the oneness of the divine consciousness, and its separateness is now released in the union with the divine. Third step, the realization of our universality. And it's not enough to be union with the divine, because in the union with the divine it could still be an individual union. The universe fades away from me as I am united with the divine. But in the universality, I see the divine in all beings. The universe itself is a manifestation of the divine and a play field for the divine evolution. And in the heart of each being is seated the same divine that is within me, that is me, that I am one with in union. So the realization of our universality. Where am I? Who am I? Well, I am one with all because I am one with the divine, which is one with all. And then a fourth step. This is not enough. Sri Aurobindo is uncompromising in the ideal of the spiritual perfection, as well as our transcendence. Meaning we must discover also that part of our divinity which is beyond space, beyond time, beyond conditioning of and limitation of any kind. And why is this necessary? It is only when we realize this that the freedom of the transcendence can be brought into the individual life as an active force in the manifestation. And it is only that transcendent power entering humanity in the human focus that can make for that divinization of life and the next leap of evolution. It is the power that manifests the miracle, so to say, because even every step of evolution is in some sense a miracle, drawing out what could not be possible out of what exists. So this is the fourth aspect of this liberation. And then as a complementing, here he is describing what must be achieved, and then he describes what must not be lost as the complementing idea. This is what you do, but this is what you must not do while doing this. And it's the corrective left hand of the movement. And no salvation should be valued which takes us away from the love of God in His manifestation and the help we can give to the world. if there is any salvation or any step, any degree in our evolution in which we find ourselves being drawn away from the love of God in His manifestation, or drawn away from the help of our participation in the world, then we will reject that step or that phase. Every step of our growth must hold these two things. First, love of God in His manifestation. There's a very interesting aphorism of Sri Aurobindo where he says something like this. He's surprised how people can claim to love God and not love humanity, or God in humanity. And he asks rhetorically, with whom are they in love then? If you're in love with God, then obviously you have to be able to love God in humanity equally. And so this love of God in His manifestation is the thing we have to cling to. So these two references help us at each step in our journey to keep the correction in this movement. Love of God in His manifestation. Can you begin to become conscious of this? As a first step, you'll become conscious that there is the divine presence in all things. Everything is essentially an action of the divine energy, the divine consciousness forming these things. Just that as an idea is enough, even if you don't feel it or experience it directly. When you dwell on that idea repeatedly and persistently, after a while you begin to perceive it. After a while it becomes more and more distinct and concrete. And with the sense of the divine presence in things or supporting from behind things, the heart opens and gives itself to the love, in love to the divine, or receives the divine love through that underlying presence or through the forms. And on that the relationship is built. This as a practice is so simple.